All right, so what we're going to do first is we need to create our organization inside of Windows before we get into organizing our stuff inside of Cinema, okay? On your cheat sheet, grab one, you'll see where it says External Project Organization. So we're going to follow that folder structure for all of the assignments that we do. But first we need to create a folder for this class, okay? And that folder for this class will house all of our stuff. Has anyone here never used a PC before? Or not a lot of experience on PCs? Okay, some people have only been in Macs. On the computers, you have a desktop, you have a C drive. Those things are not, they're both writable, but when the computer reboots, they get reset back to default. So never work off of the desktop or My Documents or downloads or any of that stuff. You want to work only off the P drive or your external if you have that, okay? So on the P drive on the computer, go into there. I don't have a P drive, so I just make a folder called P drive. That suffices for us. You're going to make a new folder. You're going to call it your last name underscore 2510 underscore F18. Okay, this will be our folder for this class. So any work that we get should be organized into this. If you have me for multiple classes, you could have a main folder that you have all your other folders in. That way your stuff is kind of contained. Day to day, hour to hour, that folder could be deleted. Someone could walk in right after you leave, sit down at the computer, and delete that folder. So before you leave today, take that folder with you. Put it on your external, save it, whatever you have to do, okay? It doesn't happen too often, but it does happen. Cool. Even your externals, those could crash too, so make sure you save that. So now we're going to go into that folder, and we're going to make a new folder called your last name underscore mini room. Okay, so mine's Sarcona underscore mini room. Inside that folder, you'll make folders for each one of those things. Yes, sir? Okay, so you have your main folder, last name underscore 2510 underscore F18. Inside that, you have a folder, your last name underscore mini room. That's our project that we're going to work on. And then inside that, you have final reference, renders, scenes, and textures. So what do you think is going to go in the final folder? Finished product, right? So mainly the stuff that we're going to be turning in. The way that 3D works, typically you work on this file, which is like a Cinema 4D file. You model stuff in it, you texture stuff, you render stuff out, take that in After Effects, make it into a movie, and then that movie is your final product, okay? That's basically what you would put inside that folder. Sometimes you may have just a still image. If you look at a car that's in a magazine, that car is something that was in 3D, brought into the computer, scanned, rendered, whatever, and then saved out as a TIFF or a JPEG or whatever. Under reference, what do we think is going to go in there? Reference images, right? So any research we do, we may, when we get to like our drone, we may find 20 pictures of drones. We would just throw the pictures inside there. Our renders, you may not know what these are yet, but these are going to be the rendered images. So for every frame of our animation, we will get one frame rendered out from Cinema 4D, okay? So if we have 120 frame animation, we'll have 120 different images that will come out of there, and we'll put those together to make a movie. Our scenes will be our actual Cinema 4D files, okay? And then textures are any images that we're going to use inside of our scene. So if we wanted a cube to look like wood, we would find a picture of wood, put that in the textures folder, and then in Cinema we'd be able to say this cube should have that picture assigned to it, okay? Or even like the text that's on this box, that would be a texture also. Anything outside of basic things like gradients or solid colors or some noise, typically you would bring those and put those as a separate texture. And just so you can see too, I don't need that for this class, there are Texturescom. There we go. There's a website called Texturescom, and this is dedicated to downloading textures. So when we get to that point, we will go to this website. One of your homework pieces for tonight, and you can jot this down, is to get a Texturescom account. Maybe even by the end of class today, you may have one if we get that far, okay? It's a free account. You're able to download textures from this account. And the textures are just images. They're just pictures. Typically, they've been processed so that if I have a picture of concrete, that it doesn't look like just a random picture of concrete. It looks like something that's very uniform that I could put into my 3D world, and it would look like something that is part of that world, okay? By that, let's go to concrete so you can see it. You can see how this is concrete, that is. It's not just like a Google picture of concrete. Like this, okay? This wouldn't make a good texture because that's like a perspective picture. These make good pictures because they're straight on, there's no perspective to them, they're very flat, there's not a lot of shadowing or lighting on top of them. Okay, so you'll find a lot of really cool things on this site. Even stuff like this, although for a lot of things that we're going to be doing wouldn't really apply to it, but you still can use these kinds of things for different kinds of textures you may use for other stuff. If you took the Intro to Photoshop class, which I'm sure you did, at some point you may already have a Texturescom account, okay? This is one of the resources. There's a million other ones that are out there too for downloading textures. Just so you're aware, you can use Google to get textures, but the problem is that these textures don't belong to you. These textures belong to someone. Usually it's a company and they're trying to they have a library that they're trying to sell you. All the ones that are on here, these are free for you to use. You can make money off of any project here. So if you're working at a company and you grab this image, you use it inside your stuff, it's fine. If I am working at a company and I grab this image and use it, well, someone may have a copyright on that image and I could get sued and the company could get sued and I would lose my job because I used an image that I'm not allowed to use, okay? So always practice being safe. Use Texturescom or another free, royalty-free site, okay? You can, if you wanted premium access, you can sign up and get 250 credits for $22, or it goes up from there. The more credits you have, the more things you can download. Let's see, here's wood. Our free account will limit us as to what we can download. You can see this says free, and then this one is a premium one. For 25 credits, you can get the larger image. When we get to it, and this class is not going to be terribly important, when you get to making something look realistic, you want a super high-res texture because that will just make the model look that much better. If let's say I have this wood texture here, I have a floor. If this is stretched out and I'm kind of in one area, it's going to look pixelated. Regardless of what my render settings are, that floor is going to look horrible. If I had an extra large version of it, it might look pretty decent having it, at that size. You can also make your own textures. So if you literally just took a picture of a wall like this, you could bring that into Photoshop, clean it up, and then use it as a texture, okay? There's a lot of stuff that people do for that. There's even this thing called photogrammetry. I'm jumping ahead, but it's cool to see these kinds of things. Photogrammetry is basically someone goes out and they take like 100, 200 pictures of an item, a rock, a building, or whatever it is. They put it inside this software, and the software actually builds a 3D model that is fully textured of what you took a picture of. And so when you see something in a movie where it's like, wow, that looks like pretty realistic, that's how they do it. Like that there is a bunch of pictures of this area brought in and made a 3D model of it. Same thing there, same thing there. Okay, even your phone, they have some simple apps. You can like move around an item with your phone and it kind of does it, not as high detailed as that. Cool. All right. So back to our folder structure. So P drive, our name, Sarcona mini room. All right, so this structure will be the same structure we use for every single project, okay? This will not change. Everything is going to be pretty much what you see. Who likes to do extra work? You guys like to do extra work? If you want to do extra work, feel free to. I like to do as little work as I can while still meeting the requirements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this folder and I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it and I'm going to rename mini room to template. Now, I shouldn't say I like to do the minimum. I like to not do repetitive things over and over again. Let's put it that way. So creating those folders to me is a very repetitive task. I don't want to have to do that. So I'm going to make this template folder, and what's going to happen is the next project I have, I duplicate that folder, I rename it, and then I'm on to my next project. I don't have to worry about redoing all these folders every single time. Okay? All right, so we can close that window. Now we can open up Cinema. So hit the Windows key or go to the Start menu and just start typing in Cinema4D. And then hit go and it should open up. We're using version 19. Version 20 will be out soon. Another reason I recommend getting the version 19 as soon as possible, because typically once 20 is available, 20 is the only thing you can download. So you want to make sure that you get 19 so we're using the same software here that you are at home. Otherwise you can't go back and forth, okay? It's very difficult to do that. So get 19, that way you know you have the same one. The college typically doesn't upgrade until next semester. If it's a huge difference or there's other issues, but typically they don't upgrade the software until the next semester. Okay, who has used a 3D software before? Cool. Which ones? Which one software? I used Unreal and Unity. Okay, over here. You guys have used Cinema. What about you? And Unity. 3ds Max. Okay. Blender and Poser. Anyone else? Cool. So those are a lot of the standard ones you would use. Unreal and Unity, Maya, Cinema, Poser, Blender, they all use a similar terminology. A lot of their hotkeys are the same, so you'll find that it's a lot easier to move between different softwares like that. Typically what you're going to have though is once you start working in a 3D world and you go into Photoshop or you go into Illustrator, you will try to turn your objects like 3D, spin them around, and you won't be able to do it. This is our main area. Most of the work we do happens inside this window. You have to think of this more like clay, like we're sculpting something and actually building something, versus something like Photoshop or Illustrator where we're drawing and coloring things in and painting things, okay? So when we build a water bottle, we're actually building the water bottle structure. When we build a cube, we're actually building a cube, okay? You have your hotkey sheets? Yes, good, okay. So let's create a cube. So up here at the top it says create, and then it says object, and then it says cube. Okay, create object cube. So now we've just created a 3D item. And I don't have to say this, but I'll say it anyway. Obviously 3D just means that we have that third dimension, right? So in Photoshop and Illustrator have X and Y, left and right, up and down. This has depth to it. So this item has depth to that. If you're in Photoshop and you did any of the 3D stuff, or Illustrator you did the 3D stuff, that's all fake 3D. This is actual 3D. This is actual, like, you can spin around the items. So in order to spin around, if you look at your hotkey sheet, I don't have mine up right now. You'll see on the camera picture viewer, yeah, camera manipulation, there it is. Under camera manipulation, you'll see where it says orbit, zoom, and move, okay? Those are typically the three things that we're going to do to move around what's called a camera. We're looking through a camera right now. That's how we're seeing this cube. So when we hold down Alt and we use the left mouse button, we can orbit around it. So practice orbiting around this. If you've used 3D before, the beginning part will be a little bit of review, you know, just go with me and humor me. So left is going to do orbiting. Basically, we're like spinning around that object. Alt and the right mouse button will zoom us in and out from that object. And then Alt and middle mouse button, which is the scroll wheel, will move the camera around. Okay, so typically it takes about 4 weeks or so, depending on how much time you spend in the software, to get comfortable with that before you have to actually like think about it, right? So a lot of times now you're like, I need to zoom, what's the hotkey for that? Just keep doing it. Eventually after 4 weeks, it'll just be second nature and you won't have to worry about it. It's very easy, especially as a new person, to get lost in the software and not know like where my object just went. I don't know where anything is, okay? It'll be easier to find that out once you get your stuff, okay? So Alt, left, middle, and right mouse button. Everyone have those three down? Cool. You'll notice on the cube here, good? You'll notice on the cube here that we have a red, green, and blue arrow. You'll also notice we have these dots. You'll also notice these little like corner things, okay? Everything inside of 3D has been labeled in a way to make it easy for you to kind of read what's happening inside it. So anytime you see red, that's going to indicate one of the directions. Green will always indicate another one, and blue will always indicate another one. So those are actually like indicators, not just for fun. If you look down here at the corner, you'll see red is X, green is yellow or Y, and then blue is Z. Okay, so anytime you see red, green, blue, you'll notice it's X, Y, Z. So RGB, X, Y, Z, that's how you can remember those two things. So if I wanted to move this in the X direction, I could grab the red one and drag just that red arrow to move it. Okay, same thing with the blue, same thing with the green. Okay, so move that cube around using each one of the arrows. You may have to rotate the camera in order to see one of the arrows, because as you get to a certain point, well, it's not doing it now, sometimes it will hide one of the arrows and you won't be able to see it. Or like this one, I really can't get the blue one very good because it's like facing my camera. Good, we can move stuff? Okay. I always recommend using the handles to move stuff around. Without clicking on anything, I can just click and drag out here and it lets me move my item. But what's happening is it's moving it level with the camera, okay? So if my camera is at a weird angle and I start moving it, it's going to move that item at a weird angle. So I'll show you if I put this like right on the ground. There it is. It's pretty much perfectly on the ground. And then I click and drag this and move it over here. It looks like it's still on the ground, but you'll see it's not. Okay? So you always want to use the handles. That way it's obvious that it's like staying exactly where you want it to be. It's not moving up away from that ground plane. Okay? These other corner pieces, those help you lock it so it only moves in two directions, not just one. So in this case, if I wanted to, okay, it's on the ground. If I wanted to move this over here but still stay on the ground, I could grab this green one and it lets me move it over there and it still stays on the ground. Okay, so you'll use those sometimes, typically not too often, but sometimes you use those. The dots that are on top of this, those allow you to resize that cube. So I'm going to click and drag on any one of the dots, doesn't matter which. And you can see how I can resize what that cube looks like. A lot of times in 3D, again, thinking of this as like clay, if I'm modeling a person, I wouldn't want to start with just modeling the finger of a person. I'd actually want to start probably with just a block of clay that roughly resembles the form, and then start to refine where the arms are, where the legs are, where the chest is, and all that stuff, okay? So by resizing this, we're getting this to a closer area of what our object would be, okay? This item over here, this, which is just like a little plate thing, that's pretty much the same proportions as that. So if I was trying to build this, I would probably start with a shape like that, okay? If I'm trying to build a triangle or a pyramid, or a house or something else, maybe I would start with a different shape, but for now that's the shape that I kind of have there, right? So always kind of have that image in mind of what is it going to look like at the end, and then how am I going to work my way backwards to get to that point, okay? This item has a bunch of settings that come in with it. So over here on the right, you'll see the size XYZ and then segments XYZ. So the size is obviously what we were just tweaking. As I grab those points and move them, I'm just adjusting the size. That's all that's doing there, okay? As I adjust the segments, and if I just click and drag on here, you can see how I can add more segments into this. Okay, so depending on how detailed I want this item to be, I can add more segments. Your goal when you model anything is to start off low and then add divisions as needed. If I'm going to model a person, I'm not going to add 1,000 divisions and then try to form it into a person. It wouldn't work. What I'd want to do is start off with a little bit, shape those. Define a little bit more, shape those. Define a little bit more, shape those. If I look at what a 3D modeled head looks like, wireframe. This is what the final image would look like. This is what it would look like as I'm working on it. Okay, so I would never try to just jump right to this stage, because the more points you have, the more difficult it is to keep everything nice and smooth. With these points, it's very easy to, okay? You'll also notice how lines are kind of moving around the shape. That's important as well. How the lines move will dictate how the surface is going to flow, okay? So things like this, having these circles around where the mouth is, it's intentional because if you look at the muscles of the mouth, that's a good one, you can see they're rounded, right? So if I'm trying to model a character, I need to actually understand what's underneath that character. And so the muscles are rounded, so I want to actually model it rounded. That way when the character's mouth is moving, it's going to move more closer to what that would be in real life, okay? So we would never go with something like this many divisions right off the bat. That's like a crazy amount of divisions. So I'm just going to leave those back at 1, 1, and 1. We also have a couple other things here. Separate surfaces. This allows us to have, right now we have a cube. How many faces are on a cube, or how many sides? 6, right? So if I hit separate surfaces, it'll create 6 different surfaces. Not right away, but when I hit another button. Fillet, or fillet, however you want to say that, will give some nice rounding to it, okay? So here, when I added divisions, these divisions are perfectly flat. They have no motion to them. They're just perfectly flat, going the same direction. When I add this, it creates a rounding right on the edge, and then it has its own divisions here that I could then control to say how many divisions I want that to have and how big I want that radius to be. And you'll see the second that I did that, let me turn that off, turn it back on, I got these. These 3 points here are going to dictate that fillet radius. And then there's no slider for the subdivision, so I would just click on that to get more subdivisions. Okay? As you model more and more and more stuff, you will get a better idea of how many subdivisions you need. Your goal when you model something is to model it. If it's falling apart, either try to fix it or scrap it and start over again. Sometimes you'll find that modeling something the first time is going to take, let's say, 3 hours. The second time might take an hour. The third time might take 20 minutes. Okay? And I've witnessed that in students. When they modeled something, it crashes or it doesn't work out. Then they model it again, they model again. Not only are you getting faster at doing it, but that model is turning out better each time. Okay? So don't be afraid to remodel stuff if you have to. Cool. So now I'm just going to delete the cube. So now it's gone. So now let's go back to create object and create a cylinder. And if you need to, you can hit O on the keyboard, and that's your frame selection tool, and that will just frame you to that item. You'll see the cylinder obviously looks different than a cube, but more importantly, the reason I did that is to show you that all the options here on the side are also different. Okay? It has radius, it has height segments, it has rotation segments, it has orientation. The cube didn't have any of that stuff. Okay? Every object you create will have its own set of parameters on the side there. And it has its own spots here. So here's where the height of this is. There's a little dot right there. There's also a dot here. I can change the height segments. I can change the rotation segments. I can change the orientation. Don't be afraid to play with these settings. The only way you're going to understand what they are is when you have a connection with these settings. Watching me do it doesn't create that connection. You have to actually do it. Yes, ma'am. It doesn't show them. Is what do we have on? Display, grand shading. I have that. So under your display here, if you go to Gorad Shading Lines, it will show you the lines right here under the submenu, and then go to that Gorad Shading Lines. Do you see it now? If at any point what I'm saying up here doesn't match what you're doing, yeah, let me know right away so we can get it corrected. Do you see it there? All right, so there's that. We also have, this is just the object tab. This is all the stuff that goes into making that object, these settings. There's also one for caps. And in here I can say I don't want caps, I do want caps. Or maybe I want to fillet the edges here. Maybe I want to adjust the radius of that, or take the divisions down. There's also a slice one, so I could slice it and only have half of this if I wanted to. Maybe I want a regular grid versus what that was. Okay, so with each item, there's a lot of different settings that go into making that item look the way it looks initially. So don't think that you have to stick with the exact one I'm using. Typically, it's a good way to start off, but also explore. When you're modeling something, see what is going to be the best shape to start off with. If I'm doing a computer screen, I'm going to start off with a cube. Well, if I model anything, typically I start off with a cube, okay? Because a cube is the simplest form, and then I can add divisions. If I was going to do something like this container here, I would start off with a cylinder, right? That kind of makes sense because it's cylinder shaped. If I was going to do this diffuser here, I would start off also with a cube just because of how the divisions are laid out. One of the things we want to watch for is what are called quads, okay? So if we look at this, well, first of all, what does a quad mean to anyone? 4, right? So a quadrilateral is 4 sides. A triangle, which would be the other one, is 3 sides. So we want quads. We want 1, 2, 3, 4-sided faces on our objects all over the place. It creates nice, smooth blending when we have to blend stuff, and our tools work a lot better. When we have a triangle like this, the tools don't work as good as they could, okay? So things like adding more divisions becomes more difficult when we don't have quads. So I typically would not start off with a sphere. You don't have to do this part here, I'll just do this. Because when I create a sphere, you can see it creates this like triangle pattern right at the top. If I start off with a cube, everything's already quadded, so I can just start adding divisions and everything stays pretty uniform throughout. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if I wanted, let's say I'm modeling a car, and I don't need to model both halves of the car at once, I can basically make the rough shape, cut it in half, delete one half of it, and just focus on that one side. And then when I'm done, flip it over to the other side. Okay, same thing with a person. Anything that's symmetrical, you do that too, okay? All right, so that's our cylinder. Wonderful. There's also a couple other ones. Fong, we'll get into what that means. Coordinates and basic. Basic is just like some basic information. You'll see some of this as we go. Coordinates is the actual like X, Y, and Z position of it. So if I'm in the move tool and I move this, you'll see the coordinates for this, the Z changed. Okay, if I move it up, the Y changed. If I move it in the red, the X changed. Okay, so that's all that is. So let's say I wanted to rotate my item. So I'm going to hit R, and R will let me get to the rotate tool, and you'll see the same thing. We have red, green, blue. We will only grab right on the red, green, or blue band, and then we can rotate the item around. So switch to your rotate tool, which is R, and then just rotate the item around. Practice getting it right on the band. And you'll know it's right on the band because it won't rotate any other direction when you do it. It's only like going in that one direction as you rotate. It's not going like crazy like this one. Cool. We can move, we can rotate, we can scale, which is T. If you hit T, you'll get to the scale manipulators. You have a red, a green, and a blue. This one is not going to work the way you would think it would. I want to make this longer. You would think I'd be able to grab the red and make it longer. I can't. Okay? Right now, the default settings are kind of overriding any scaling that I do. Basically, any scale at this point is just uniform. It's not going to go in one direction over another. It's just going to be the same thing for all three. So I'm going to hit a button that lets me do that so I can adjust it individually. So if you look at the top of my screen, right up here it says perspective, and right next to that there's like a little sphere, like a white sphere, and then a white sphere with like an orange selection. I'm going to either click on that or hit C. It's the hotkey for that button. What that does is it takes all those settings that we just set up on this and it bakes them or locks them to that item. So it says it's just a flattened out item now. It's kind of like Photoshop. You have all these effects going on. You can't really do anything to that layer until you flattened it and merged it out. That's what we just did. Okay? So now if I were to grab this red, I can scale out just the red or just the green or just the blue. Okay? Now what I lose though is I lose the ability to go back to any of these settings we had over here on the side and tweak any of those. So I can't go back to the divisions or the slicing or the fillet and tweak any of those settings. Okay, so there will be an order to things of how we build stuff that gets us to that phase where we're ready to actually hit C and then actually start tweaking the model further. Okay. I'm going to delete that again, and I'm just going to create a basic cube again. you'll see that as we create items, the name shows up over there, right? So we created a cylinder, it said cylinder. We created a cube, it said cube. Some of the stuff that we do will be listed over here. On the right side of this, these will be what are called tags. So right now this cube is not on a layer, that's what that one means. It's visible because these two are on. It's visible in the scene because it's not there. And then it has this Fong tag on top of it, okay? As we get more into cinema, you'll see how we can add a bunch of different kinds of tags to get it to do different types of things. Just for fun, let's take the cube and we're going to go to MoGraph and we'll go to Cloner. Okay, so I click the cube, I went to MoGraph, and then I went to Cloner. Now what that does is it creates a cloner object right there. Okay, every object you create inside Cinema is listed inside this area. The cube is not being cloned right now. Even though we had it selected and we went to Cloner, it's not being cloned. Cinema has a way where things have to be nested correctly or grouped correctly in order for things to work. So the cloner has to have the cube as a child. Okay, so right now they're both at the same like tree level. If I grab the cube and drop it onto the clone, see how the arrow's pointing down? Now the cloner has the cube as a child of it. Okay, so drop your cube on the cloner so that it is underneath it. And you should do that. Like it doesn't look like a cube anymore. It's like stretched out or something. Good? Yes? No? No? All right, so now what's happening is the cloner is basically a duplicator. Instead of us having to go through and duplicate the item and move it, duplicate the item and move it, the cloner automatically duplicates it however many times we specify, okay? And right now the default is set to 3, so we have 3 cubes right there, and it's also set to like offset each one in the Y direction a little bit. So if we click on the cube, you'll see the cube's options are right here, and if we clicked on object, you would see again those same settings that we had before, okay? So nothing has changed that. The cube is still the same kind of cube we had before. If we click on cloner, we'll get a few more tabs. And the main one that we're going to jump to is the one that says object, okay? So this is how the items are being cloned. So they're being cloned linearly, meaning like straight, right? Don't worry about the rest of that yet. It's duplicating it 3 times. And then here where it says PY, position Y, it's moving each one 50 centimeters up. So basically like takes our original clone cube, duplicates it up 50, then duplicates it up 50 more, okay? All the arrows that you see inside Cinema, there's like an up arrow, down arrow. You can click and drag on that to change it. You don't have to like click on it a bunch of times. So if I just click and drag on this PY one and drag it up, you'll see how I could then make those clones a little bit further apart. Okay, so just give them a little bit of space just so you can see that obviously you have space between the clones. Okay, now I put in, mine's at 286, yours might be at 300. Try not to lock yourself into, I need my numbers to match your numbers. They don't, okay? For the most part, you really want to look at the stuff and see what is going to look good, because in this, that's what we care about. If you were in CAD or CATIA or Unigraphics, you have to be very precise, you know, down to the 0.0001 millimeters or something. We don't have to be. All right, so I have 3 clones. They're duplicated 286 centimeters apart. If I click on my count, you'll see how it just adds more clones to that group. Okay, and this is one of the things that Cinema has, other softwares don't have. Okay, and this is one of the reasons that people go to Cinema is for this kind of stuff. If we were to change the PX, you'll see how the clones move up and over. If we change the scale, you'll see how they also scale as they're getting offset too. Okay? So all I've done here is I created a cloner, I dropped a cube into the cloner, and then I changed the amount of copies and just modified some of these position and scale settings. Now this is the surface of what this tool can do. There's so many areas where you'll see this cloner doing stuff. Like if you watch videos after this, not this class period, but after you're done with this class, you'll really see like that cloner is literally all over motion graphics. We can change the type. So instead of the mode being linear, I can change this to radial. Okay, so by changing it to radial, the settings that were there are now gone. We have new settings. So I'm just going to take the radius up. And I can take the count up as well. And you can see how I'm able to get, obviously, a rounded duplication of this. Everyone's following so far? So no? Okay, good. All right. All right, so now let's go back to the cube. Okay, so we modified some stuff on the cloner just so we can get some different shapes. Now let's jump back to the cube and hit the cube, and hit fillet. And then I'm going to lower this radius because that 40 looks horrible. There we go, that's good. I'm going to go to like 5, I think is good there. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so what do we notice about that? It updated, right? So any changes we do to the cube, it does it to all the cubes, right? So it's not just like the one cube that it did it to. Anything we put in there, it'll automatically do that to it. So if we had a person dancing, we could actually have a cloner and have 50 people dancing, which is one of the uses for it. I got a question. Mm-hmm. Well, there's nothing we can do to the cube here except for change how the clones are at. Right. So we can't change any fillets. This is just controlling how they're being cloned. Yeah. Now, just like we hit the C key before, we're not going to do it this time. If I were to hit the C key, that bakes that cloner in and locks it so that whatever the shape it is, that's what it's going to look like. Okay. So very rarely do we ever do that. Usually it's only when we take it out of this software and bring it into another software that we would do something like that. Let's create a cylinder. And I'm going to kind of change the proportions of this to be a little bit more like squarish, cubish. Okay, so I changed my radius to like 130 or so. All right, now what I want to do is I want the cylinder to be part of that cloner thing. Like I want the cylinder to also be cloned. So how do I get the cylinder to also be cloned? Yep, make it a child. So I just drag the cylinder into the cloner. And then what we see is we're getting an alternating pattern. Cube, cylinder, right? Again, one of the powerful things about Cinema is that a lot of times we'll use low-res geometry for a lot of the stuff that we're doing. And then when it's time to render, it's time to actually make it look pretty, we'll drop in the higher res stuff to make things go quicker. Even though things are moving pretty quick, like I can do that and it's not chugging, sometimes this will go super slow depending on how many divisions each piece of geometry has. Right now we're dealing with only, in my case, 10 items, but sometimes you may have 1,000 items or 2,000 items, and your system will literally just like chug as it tries to like spin around that item, okay? Cool. So let's drop another item in there. So let's create, do something from the upper area here, nothing like the figure. People grab that all the time, don't do that. So like the polygon or the cone you could do, or the torus, I'll grab the torus. There we go, I'll drop it into the mix. And then I adjusted my number as well because I had an uneven number of items, so I was getting some duplicating, so I changed it to 12, I think it did. Some factor of 3 that works. Okay, so this is an unlimited thing. So you could add 50 different items to this list if you wanted to. You could just keep dropping them in there. Now let's say that we didn't want it to do like this pattern type thing. We want it to be a little bit more random than what it is. So that's where where it says clones iterate, that's where we would change that. So iterate just means torus, cylinder, cube, in my case, whatever yours is. Okay, so it starts at the top and works its way down. Changing that to random, we'll get exactly that. Instead of the clones being iterated, we'll get a random mixture of them. Now if we don't like what that random mixture is doing, we can change this seed. Okay, and all that seed is doing is just giving us a different random version of that stuff. Okay, we can also do blend. In this case, it's not going to do anything, but typically what blend would do is if we had one shape that had the same amount of divisions as another shape in there, it would actually blend between the two shapes. Okay, so in this case, it doesn't do that, so it's not going to do that. And then there's sort, which is a different one that we won't need to get into right now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make sure they're not touching, so none of my objects are touching. I'm going to move my cloner above the ground. Okay, so I made sure I'm selected on my cloner, not the individual items, and just moved it so that it's above the ground. E. The move, rotate, and scale are all right at the top, and the way they have them, ERT, yes, ERT. The way they have them set up is they're right next to each other. So typically my hand is on that left side. I use Alt to tumble around, zoom in and out, move, and then when I have to move, rotate, or scale, I just jump right up to the E, R, or T. Okay, so we're above the ground. So now what I want to do is we're just going to add some dynamics to this. The dynamics will just make everything just fall. Okay, so this is where those tags come in. So I'm going to make sure I'm clicked on the cloner. I'm going to go to Tags, Simulation, Rigid Body. So I'm clicked on the cloner. I go to Tags, Simulation, Rigid Body. Okay, and then what we get is we get this, which is a new tag to the mix. So a second ago that was not on there. Now we have, now we have that extra tag there. So if I click on the cloner, you don't see anything new here, but if I click on that tag, you'll now see all of this stuff that goes into making this a dynamic item. Okay? So if I were to hit the play button, which is play button right there, you'll see it fall. And then it goes off frame. Okay? There's no ground by default, so we should probably put a ground in. So I'm going to rewind this. Just like your VCR, you hit the rewind button. Do you guys know what a VCR is? Yeah, okay. I'm going to go here to where this says floor and just click on the floor. Okay? Now, even though this is another piece of geometry, if I were to hit play, it would just go right through it. Everything in 3D has to be explicitly spelled out for it. So if this item is a rigid body that's meant to fall down with gravity, then another item has to be a colliding item, otherwise gravity it'll just pass right through it, okay? So I'm going to click on the floor, I'm going to go to Tags, Simulation, and say Collider Body. And then if I hit play again, or rewind if I need to and then play, it should actually interact with the ground. Boop. That's a good question. So right now it's treating that cloner as one solid object because we haven't told Cinema these are all separate pieces. So I'm going to go to the tag for the cloner. I'm going to go to collisions, and under inherit tag I'm going to say apply tag to children. And then under individual elements I'm going to say all. So now if I rewind it and play again, they all fall down. So I use Maya. That was like my main tool that I used for years and years and years. Just doing the cloner where we have these items that are, duplicated, I could definitely do. I could duplicate stuff, no problem. But when I wanted to change that, I basically have to wipe out all the stuff I did and reduplicate with new items. Okay, they didn't have something like this that was just so interactive where I could just change a number, move things around, and it would automatically do that. And then adding dynamics to it that are this quick is another thing that Maya can do, but it's not as fluid as this. Okay, so one of the reasons people use Cinema is because of this kind of interactivity. And if I pause this, rewind it, and I just go back to the cloner, maybe I change my radius, maybe I change the count, and hit play, everything still works. Okay, it's very quick, very intuitive to be able to use this kind of stuff. I could even take the cloner and rotate it slightly. Oops, if I hit the right button. And this will give me a different interaction. Now with this, because it's so quick, we actually lose a little bit of accuracy here. We're not noticing it. This is a pretty simple scene. But when you get into more complex scenes, you will notice that some of your stuff is not acting the way that it should, and it's very difficult to kind of go through and fix it, okay? So for motion graphics, it's perfect. If we were to do a movie and we had something like a building shattering and falling apart and crumbling, this would not be the tool for it, okay? So just so you're aware of the kind of differences between some of the tools. Let's also go back to the cloner. It's pretty boring to have all the shapes being the same size, okay? I showed before how I can go to the settings in this object and change the scale of them. The radial one doesn't have that, okay? Even if I switched it to the other one, it would just gradually get smaller or gradually get rotated or whatever. What I want to do is randomly scale and rotate each one of these items so it's not so perfectly looped around. So while clicked on the cloner, I'm going to go up to MoGraph, I'm going to go up to Effector, and then I'm going to go to Random. Okay. Now what that does is it randomizes something inside that object. Something inside the cloner got randomized. Just like when we originally created the cloner, it automatically had some parameters there. This random automatically has some parameters there. So if we go under parameter, we should see exactly what it was randomizing. Okay? What was it randomizing? Yeah, position. Okay? So with position checked and each one of those numbers at 50, it's going to randomly move them in X, Y, and Z 50 units. I'm not too concerned with the position. I'm just going to uncheck it, and that'll put it back to where they were. What I do want to do is randomly scale them, so I'm going to check the scale on. Now this is I don't like how they do this, but that's how they do it, so whatever. It's set to 0, meaning that there's no randomization. If I want them to scale down, I have to put in a decimal point, like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, something like that. If I want them to scale uniform, I would say uniform scale, and then I would type in a number like 0.125 or 0.05 or something. Okay, you'll notice that there's not a huge change. Okay, even with this at 0.5, even at 0.1. So I actually have to go up to like 0.25, 0.5, 0.8, until I get something that's a little bit more like random. It's like obviously random. That's too much because they're colliding now, so maybe 0.5. Okay. If I see that maybe something is colliding, and I'm like, okay, well, maybe these toruses are too big, I can always jump back to my original torus and shrink the size of that torus down. So this is one of those things that, you know, can be confusing because we're working on multiple layers here, multiple levels of things. We have our cloner. The cloner has a random. It also has dynamics. It's also being fed by these 3 items. Those 3 items each have their own properties. So there's a lot of different areas for us to go through and tweak different things to get them to do what we want them to do. This is a pretty simple scene, but it can get very complicated. Yes, ma'am. If they aren't or are, it'll just explode. I'll show you. And sometimes the computer will crash if it doesn't like something that's happening. So let's, just for our own sanity, let's save real quick. I'm going to save my stuff and put it into my 2510 mini room scenes folder, and I'm just going to call this Sarcona_playing. It's rare that cinema crashes, but usually when it does, it's on dynamics. Okay. So those are overlapping. I'm going to hit play, and you'll see they just kind of like push each other apart. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it'll actually try to figure out how is these 2 pieces supposed to work together, and it'll literally, you hit the play button and it just goes to frame 2 and stops. 10 minutes later it might jump to frame 3 or something, but in this case we're pretty good. We could even test this out by just going crazy with the count number here. There we go, so that's like 200. Okay. Now, in some instances, we may want some overlap. So a couple years ago, we did this assignment in cinema where we would do this breakfast scene. And in the breakfast scene, we had a bowl of cereal. So one of our things was we would duplicate a torus, that was our cereal, and it would basically, they would all be overlapping. We'd hit the play button and then wait for them to relax, and then we would stop it, and then that's what the shape of the cereal would be. Okay? So sometimes you'll use them overlapping just so you can get a relaxed shape, and then you'll lock it into that. But you'll see, even at 200, this is playing back incredibly quick. Some softwares, Maya, would not be playing back very quick. Oops. There we go. So there we go. And then maybe my cylinder's a little bit too big too, so I'll just take the radius of that down. And my cube. Right? The cool thing about dynamics, and this is one of the things I love about 3D, you change a parameter here or there, and it changes the entire animation. So you can really get some really cool stuff. Right now, just so, I mean, we can keep tweaking this forever, if we hit play, you'll see how they kind of fall and then do a little bit of bouncing, right? If I go to my dynamics for the cloner, I can take the friction off on collisions, take the bounce up, and I do the same thing on the floor. Click the dynamics for that, change the bounce to 100, the friction to 0, and what I should get is a bouncier surface for each one of those items. Right? So now there's a little bit more energy there. Just by changing a couple parameters, you can get some really cool stuff. Or I can take the friction like really far up and the bounce really far down. And again, it changes what that looks like, okay? So sometimes you'll see these kinds of animations where it literally is, if you look at it, okay? So there's nothing outside of just even this that is terribly too complicated that people don't use in their reel and make look very cool. Awesome. All right, let's take a 10-minute break. Go to the bathroom, get something to drink, walk around a little bit, and then come back and we'll continue working. All right, so this is where we left it off. It's just dynamics, things fall down, like that. Okay, so we have something somewhat modeled. We have something animated. We have a little scene here. Let's see what this is going to look like as an output, okay? Because right now we're just seeing it in viewport. What's going to happen is we're going to hit this button and it's going to go through and try to basically calculate what do the lights look like in the scene, what do the materials look like in the scene. If any of these are like chrome or glass, it'll calculate all that stuff, okay? Right now we have nothing, so it's just going to be basically flat colors, okay? So if we hit Control R, you'll see how it updates right in the viewport and shows us what our items look like. If we hit Shift R, it pops it open in a new viewer, okay? Shift R is the preferred method of doing that because in this we're able to actually save different iterations and see what different iterations would look like. So if I change the color of something, sometimes I want to see the before and after so I can compare the two things. So Control R does it in the viewport, doesn't save it. Shift R does this, okay? And those are on your sheet, or should be on your sheet. They aren't on your sheet. I didn't put them on there. There you go. You can write it down. So Control R renders it in your viewport. Shift R renders it to the picture viewer. All right, now what we may notice with this is it looks pretty boring. Everything, all of our items, our main objects are this kind of like whitish gray color. The ground is a dark gray color. Way in the background it's black. There's no lighting in the scene. It's just very kind of like drab, okay? So we're going to close the picture viewer. You can keep your picture viewer on your other screen if you want to. Typically, if I'm working multiple screens, I will keep it over there, but I don't for the lecture. Let's add a light to the scene. So under the light bulb here, I'm going to just create a regular light. And the way you move it is you move it just like a regular light. Consider this to be like a light bulb. So it's going to start wherever that middle point is and emanate outwards. And then again, you can hit Shift R and see what that's going to look like with the new changes in there. Especially as beginners, you should kind of do something, check the settings, do something, check the settings, constantly seeing what it's looking like. Good? Okay. You'll notice that the opposite side, the stuff that is not being lit up, is completely black. Lights inside of a 3D environment are not actual physical lights that we would see in the real world. The real world, lights emit light, they have shadows, sometimes they hit objects or surfaces and bounce off and light up other things. None of that is by default in here. All of it we have to tell it we want to do. And the more stuff we add to it, the more expensive / time consuming it is to render stuff out. So this took, and this is one of the things that we will have to keep a particular eye on. The render time right here, it says 0, 0, 0, 0. So basically it took 0 seconds to render, meaning it was less than a second. I hit the button and it's up, okay? Don't do this to yours. I'm just going to show you if I add that feature to this. Okay. And now I hit Shift R. So we went from basically 0 seconds we're still waiting. Yep. This is global illumination. So this tells our light bounce off of objects and then light up other sides of them. So almost done. There we go. So 34 seconds. Okay, so it's a pretty simple scene. All we've done is turn global illumination on. It looks a lot better. If I use my arrow keys to see the before and after, you can see that looks a lot better having it on there, but that's the cost of it, is the render time. okay? This is something that we have to pay attention to because it took 34 seconds for one frame, but if we had an animation, that's 34 seconds times our entire animation, right? And that adds up pretty quick. Just so you can see how I do the math, roughly half a minute, right? 30 seconds. So 30 seconds times, let's say 90 frames, is 2,700 seconds, which is 45 minutes. Right. So this animation, for me to render it, would now take 45 minutes for me to get that out, okay? So every change we do, we have to make sure that it's for a purpose, that it's enhancing the render. Otherwise, we're going to be wasting a lot of time, okay? Cool. So I'm going to turn that off so it doesn't do that. Standard, turn that off. Okay, so Shift R, I'm back to where we were. Now what we can do is we can fake global illumination, okay? And the way we fake it is we just add more lights to the scene, and then that fakes global illumination. It's not perfect, it's faking it, it's cheaper, so we'll do that. So I'm going to take my light and duplicate it. Now this is where I kind of have to have an idea about where I'm going to be rendering my stuff from. So the video that we watched, he was basically at like plane level and the things just kind of like dropped, and he probably went from one side of it to the other side of it, kind of like a sweep across the front of them, or kind of like in a bit of an arc, right? Very rarely would you go all the way around your item like this, okay? So what I'm going to do is find a good angle for this, and I'm going to say that this is going to be the angle I would render this scene out at, okay? Because it's kind of the most dynamic to see what's going on. Here, you know, it's okay, but you really don't get the full effect. Same thing there, same thing here. I kind of like this like 3/4 angle, okay? Now the reason that's important is because when I light this up, I want to light it up from where my camera is going to see it. I don't care about the back side. The back side could look like whatever. I want to make sure that the front of this looks good. So I'm just going to take my light and duplicate it. How do you duplicate stuff in Illustrator? By dragging it. What do you hold? Alt. It's not Alt, it's Control inside here, but same kind of thing, right? So I want to duplicate my light. I just hold Control and drag that light over, and I'll have a second light. Okay, so I just hold Control, drug my light kind of to where my camera was going to be, and then rendered it out again. I may actually want to move it down some. Oops. And over some. Yeah, that looks like a good spot. All right, now because I have two lights in my scene, I'm basically getting like double the lighting going on. Okay, so it's making everything twice as bright. So now we have to take the levels of the lights, the intensities of the light, and kind of balance them so that it doesn't look overlit. It's hard to see on the projector, but it's way like overlit, okay? Just as an example of this, you've seen Finding Nemo before? Okay. In that movie, in the underwater scenes, there are about 200 lights that they would have to manage throughout the entire scene, because in order for them to get the water to look right and get everything lit up correctly, they needed that many lights. So us having two is not a big deal. Sometimes you will have 20 lights or 30 lights or whatever. For most of the stuff we're going to do, it's going to be minimal lights. So I'm going to go to light here, and I'm going to rename this to be main light, okay? So I have a light that's above my stuff, shining down. That's my main light. My other light I'm going to rename as bounce light. That way I know the bounce light is probably going to have less energy, less intensity than my main light, okay? My main light will have shadows. My bounce light will not have shadows, okay? So I'm going to go to my bounce light and take the intensity to like 35%. We'll see. Don't think that you have to lock this number in right away. You really have to develop an eye for what's going to look good. So that's 35%. That looks pretty decent. My other light, I don't think I need to adjust the intensity. Now that I've taken that bounce light down, they balance well right now. I am going to go to my main light, go to the shadow, and turn on Shadow Maps Soft. Okay, so I clicked on my main light, I went to the Shadow tab, and turn on Shadow Maps Soft. And then render again. You can see how often you render when you're doing this kind of stuff. Now you may get some drastic shadows. My shadows are pretty drastic because my light is basically right at the center of that. And just like a real light, it's the angle of the light going out, hitting the objects, that's what's going to create those shadows. All of these different settings here for the kinds of shadows, they have a purpose. We're going with the easiest one right now, okay? So Shadow Map Soft, I'm going to take my shadow map density up a little bit, so 1500. And I'm going to take the sample radius up to, I think, 10. Okay. So just so you can see what that did, is it kind of crisped up the shadows a little bit more. Okay, so I took my shadow map up to about 1500 and then took the sample radius up to 10. I'm also going to take the density down to like 20. Maybe 35. That's good. Okay, so the density is simply just the darkness or the transparency of that shadow. That's all it is. When you get into some heavier duty 3D stuff, you really have to understand the physics about how materials work, how light works. When you look at an item like a glass with caustics, like this, the light's coming into the glass, the light's spreading out and kind of distorting the image of what's in the glass, the light's shining through it. We have some of the blue caustic material from the liquid, the clear area here, it's kind of scattered. This kind of thing is something that by default 3D softwares don't do. And Cinema has its own rendering engine, okay? So like Unreal or Unity are basically like gaming engines. There's rendering engines that just calculate all of this stuff that we're doing, okay? How it calculates the light and whatever else. There's other ones. When I went to this physical and I turned on that global illumination, that's a different rendering engine. There's another one called ProRender. There's another one called Cineman. There's another one called Arnold, another one called V-Ray, another one called Turtle, okay? There's a couple dozen rendering engines, and they all do things differently, but they're all trying to do the same thing. Give the artist complete freedom of how things look. Some of them are more accurate, some of them are less accurate, depending on what you do. Some of them are faster. It's a weird thing to have. So here's Blender's render. You can see the lights, that you can actually see like the pattern on the thing. Cycles render, it's nice and smooth. Here's another one with Cycles, Mitsuba, Nox, and Yarfray. Here's another one with Corona, Octane, Element, Thea, V-Ray, Cinema 4D, and Keyshot. Here's another one with Cycles, Lux Render, and Maxwell. The important thing is not to know, or not to feel like you have to know all the rendering engines. Knowing what looks good and then how to find those settings inside your rendering engine, that's what's key, okay? Because every company you may work for, they may use this rendering engine at one, this one at another one, this one at another one. As long as you know what looks good and you can get there, that's what's important, okay? So by doing a lot of, looking at images on the internet and seeing what looks good, that's where you get it. Also notice here too the render times. So this image took 10 minutes and 2 seconds. This one took 8:51. This one took 10:07. Notice the reflection in each one of those is completely different, right? It's subtle, but it's completely different. All right. So for this, that's good enough for that. We have some shadows, nice and soft-ish. We have some bounce light. Let's add some materials. Down here at the bottom, this is where we add materials. You can do, I'll show you the one way and then I'll show you the way I do it. You can go to create new material or new PBR material or shader and pick from here. You just have to double click. You just double click and it'll make a material. The material will define what kind of item you have. If you have glass, that would be one material. If you have plastic, that would be something else. If you have wood or metal or something reflective or refractive or whatever, all of that is going to be housed within that material. Every material can be assigned to any number of objects. So we can take, let's say we created a wood texture, and I had this wood table, and that wood table, and they all had the same look to them, the same kind of wood. I can take that wood texture and just drop it on each one. If I change the one, it changes all of them, okay? Or I can make 3 separate wood textures and assign it to each one of those if I wanted to, okay? We're going to do the simplest stuff first. Eventually we'll add some complexity to it when we get to that. So we created a material. Over here on the side, it loaded all the properties for that material. For now, we're just going to play with 2 settings, which is color and reflectance. Those are the only 2 things we're going to play with at the moment. So color is exactly that. What is the raw color of this item? So something like this stapler, the raw color of this would be black. So I would do this black if I'm trying to get a stapler, okay? So pick a random color for your cylinders in here. So I'm going to pick blue. I like that color there. Okay. Okay. So I pick blue as my initial color. You can change these later. You're not locked to it. Did you double click this down here and get a material? Right here. Like this? Okay. Can you go to that and then choose it? You got it? Cool. All right. So yeah, so don't think you're locked to that. For this, I will bring this up. So if I double click the material, it pops up a new window. Typically, I like to have that up there so that you can see it. We're going to go to reflectance also. This is the same window that's on the side here. I just popped it open so you can see it. I'm going to change the type to Beckman. Okay, so under reflectance, I'm going to change a type to Beckman. Just like there are different ways to calculate shadows, different rendering engines, there's different ways to calculate reflections. That's one of them, okay? This stapler here, if I were to look at it, trying to find a good angle. If I were to look at what this looks like, and I tried to find a spot where there's reflection here, where the highlight is, I would want to see how clear that highlight is, okay? So if I look at, I have nothing metal up here. That's insane, right? There we go. This is metal-ish. So if I look at this, you can see the highlight kind of shining right here from the door. That is the reflection of the door in this pen. It's not crystal clear. If this was chrome, it would be like crystal clear, like a mirror ball. But it's not. It's kind of diffused and spread out. So that's where this Beckman is really good because it allows us to adjust that kind of stuff. So if I take the roughness down to 0, and I take the reflection strength up to 100, you'll see, oops, I went too far. You'll see that that now looks like a reflective chrome type sphere, okay? If I pull the roughness up, you'll see how it kind of spreads out that reflection, kind of blurs the reflection some, okay? So just kind of put it maybe like 20 and 20, or maybe 50 and 20. Yeah, that's better. So put it at 50 for the roughness and 20 for the strength. Again, you can change these. Don't get like set on like what it's going to look like for this. This is us playing around. Okay. Now to get this material onto the cylinder or any one of our items, we just drag it over here and drop it on one of those. So I just drag that material onto cylinder, and now all my cylinders will have that material on there. And then when I render it, then I can look at that material and see if I'm liking the way that's looking. If I need to adjust the reflection, the color, if we have this as a glass or whatever, we can adjust those properties as well. For now, it's wonderful, so I'm just going to close that. You just drag this right onto your cylinder. The little sphere down there. Just drag it right onto any one of your items up there. If I drug this onto the cloner, what do you think it would do? All of them, right? So the whole thing would get it. So just be aware of that, that if you have this hierarchy, whatever's on top is going to override the other stuff, okay? If I want to copy the material, what's the hotkey to duplicate stuff? Control. If you forget that, it's Janet Jackson's favorite hotkey. No Janet Jackson fans, all right. Then I'm just going to change the color. I'm going to leave the reflectance the same. I just drug a couple copies of it, and then I'm just changing the coloring. All right, sweet. So now we have some objects, we got some lights, we got some stuff there. Notice the ground, even though it's that small plane right there, it actually extends to infinity, okay? So it actually goes out forever. That's just that ground material that's in there. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do a little rendering of this. Because this is dynamic, when we hit the render button, it would kind of freak out because it doesn't know what to do, because it needs, in order for it to calculate frame 2, it needs frame 1. In order for it to calculate frame 50, it needs 49. So anytime I were to click and drag here and try to move this, it's going to freak out. Like, you can see I can go backwards and just keep going forward and back, and it's not really updating like you think it would. So I need to do what's called baking, where basically I lock in what the animation is doing. That way every single time I play it, it's the same thing. So I'm going to go to my cloner's dynamic tag. I'm going to go to my cache, and I'm going to say bake all. And most likely it'll flicker and then nothing happens, okay? Now what that does is it actually went through and baked out every single object and wrote their information into keyframes that now if I were to click and drag, I get that same animation every single time. Yes, sir? Cool. So now let's go to our render settings. So up at the top, you'll see there is a edit render settings, which is typically a clapper, like one of those movie clappers with a gear. Most of the software uses that gear and clapper as their icon for render settings. All right, so that's cool. We're going to start at the top and work our way down. So the first thing we need to know is how big are we rendering our stuff out at? If you look at your cheat sheet, you'll see something that says movie file size. So this is what's going to tell us how big our movie is going to be. So how big is our movie? Yep. Okay. Now where this number comes from, your TVs at home are probably like a 1920 by 1080 resolution or a 1280 by 720. This 960 is half of 1920. The bigger we render, the longer it's going to take to render our stuff out. Okay. So when you see, sometimes you'll see like Shrek took 3 days to render one frame. That's basically because they're rendering it huge and they're rendering so much stuff kind of like piled on top of it, okay? So 960 by 540. We need to tell it how many frames we're rendering out. So we're rendering all of our frames. So we're going to go down to frame range and say all. And this automatically populates 0 to 90. That's how many frames we have. I'm going to set this to current frame just for a second so I can show you this. So if you look close at this, you'll see there's a lot of grain and kind of like a lot of noise that goes around the edges, okay? Under anti-aliasing, that's what's going to fix that, all right? So aliasing is this stair-stepping thing that we get. Anti-aliasing is like it fixes aliasing. So it'll kind of blend in some of those edges. So we're going to go to anti-aliasing here and say best. And under filter, we'll say Mitchell. And then just so you can see a before and after of what that looks like, you can see kind of right here this graininess and how that goes away on mine. You won't be able to see it on yours because it'll actually render the entire thing. You can't see it on yours too good. If you look at the torus, you can see it. It changes a little bit, okay? Trust me on it, you'll see the benefits. All right. So anti-aliasing is up. Let's go to save and tell it where we want to save this. So I'm going to put this inside of my P drive, inside of 2510, inside of mini room, inside of renders, and I will call this Sarcona_playing. Okay, so put it inside your P drive, your folder, mini room, renders, and call it your last name _playing. You always want to name things with your last name because that's easier to find. A lot of times people will render stuff, it goes into somebody else's folder, they don't know whose it is, they delete it. If they know whose it is, they can at least put it back in their folder, okay? So make sure it's there and hit save. We also have to tell it the kind of files that are coming out of this, okay? For this class, TIFFs are perfectly fine. We can use TIFF images. We just have to change the naming convention. Right now, it's going to do name number dot extension. So frame 1 will be called Sarcona_playing 0001 dot TIFF, okay? After Effects does not like that. After Effects wants a certain naming feature. If you don't name it correctly here, if you don't click this next button, you have to go through and rename every single one of your files. Rename 90 files so that it works, or re-render it. So we're going to click on the name there and pick the very bottom one. And it's a subtle thing, but that makes it work. Okay? So make sure it's name.number.extension. So name.zeros.tiff. Okay? So all we've done in this window is 3 things pretty much. We gave it a size, 960 by 540. We told it to do all the frames. We turned our anti-aliasing up. And then we told it where to save. Okay? Those are the only 3 things that we did. Now, we're going to save it, so hit Control S again. And then hit Shift R. Okay, now what we should see is in our picture viewer on the right, it's actually going through and rendering out each one of our frames. And again, a good thing about using the picture viewer is that at any point, we can go through and check any of our frames. In some of the software, so in Maya, you can't do that. Once Maya starts rendering the way we have it currently set up, you have to wait basically until it's done or find the files on the hard drive and then open them up and check them out. Here, I can go to the start of this, hit the space bar, and actually see what that rendering is looking like. Pretty sweet. Let me go here. So I'll show you a couple examples of different animations that I might have. Projects default. Oops. I have to open it in the right folder. That's the right one. Open with. Choose. One of the softwares that we use is called DJV. It's a free one. Basically, it allows you to open up a sequence and see it outside of Cinema. Once we close Cinema down, that area is empty. So if we want to preview those again, we would open it up in DJV. You could open it in After Effects, but then it just takes more time. There it is. So this was done inside Cinema too. And the way it's done is that instead of just having objects that I've cloned, I created an MACA, and then I shattered it, and then I used the dynamics to make it all blow up, okay? And then you're seeing at the very end of this, 2 iterations. This was like blocky MACA, and then this was like the flaky one. I like that one better. That's cool. Yep. So just like we went to cloner, there's fracture. And so that would actually break our stuff apart, okay? Let me open up another one so you can see that. That's MACA break. Here's another one. I said I like dynamics, like literally, like I could literally play in dynamics all day long. Now the first one you saw was like shells, so it was like little like thin pieces that broke off. This one, it's more like chunks, like the whole thing was solid.
So do we do sound in here at all?
You can, yeah. We don't. I show it. A lot of people don't want to add it to theirs. It's fine by me. I do show where to get sound effects and how to add them to it, because it definitely does add to that. So this is what we just saw, right? So we have those objects falling. I have the word MACA. It's above the camera. It falls down and does this. This took probably a good hour after I had everything set up to make sure that it fell the way I wanted it to fall. The bounce settings were right. The friction settings were right. I actually, once it was all cached out, I went through and tried to find like a good angle for this to work. Okay, so like this one here that flips in and does that, I went around and looked at all the MACAs that were falling. I'm like, that's a cool one. That's where I want my camera set up. And then I set up all my lights around it. And then you can see the depth of field on here. So further out in the distance, those are blurrier. Right up close, it's in focus. Now this was not Cinema. This was a program called RealFlow, which does basically dynamics like fluids. So Cinema can't do this. Yep. So that's Cinema 4 or RealFlow that I did the animation in, and then all the rendering was done inside of Maya. Sweet. And then I have a couple other ones here while we're waiting. Oops, not there. Make logos. And then this one is done using a shatter effect, plus using that random to kind of move everything away and then basically bring it back together. Okay, so it's actually like animating, bring everything back together. That's all. It's in reverse, yep. So you can tell it which way to go, and so I just basically said, go backwards instead. I think that's all I have for that one. This is kind of cool. It's just cool. It's not a logo or anything, I don't think. No, it is, okay. So this is a software called Houdini, and a lot of this is kind of like scripted stuff put together in order to create that. So it's actually like on the fly generating these things that are filling the letters. It's pretty cool. Yeah, I think that's all I have in that one, yeah. Awesome. Okay, so this is done rendering, so if I hit play, I can see it. And then at this point, typically what I would do is kind of assess, do I like the way it's working? what you see in a still image is always different than what you see in the animation. When I did some of my other stuff, I would notice sometimes there was like an item way in the background that was kind of like wavering back and forth, and I'd have to go back and reset some stuff and try it again and whatever. Or you may get flickering, sometimes that happens too, but this is fine. The shadows look weird, probably on yours too, where they get really long and then really short all of a sudden because of where they're hitting. It is what it is, it's our playing one, okay? So we're going to take the last step of this. Everyone else's is done rendering? Okay. All right, so once we have a render, the next step is to actually make it a movie. All we have right now, where am I at? Right here. All we have right now are just images, that's it. 2510, mini room, renders, there we go. So you'll see I have 90 images. I could definitely give these images to someone and say, download DJV, and then open it with DJV, and they can watch it, but that does no good. If I want to upload it to YouTube, or I want to put it on my phone, whatever, I want to make it into an actual movie. I'm going to try this first. So you don't do this part yet. I'm going to try this and see if this works. Adobe After Effects is typically where we would go to do this. After Effects changed some things, so we probably have to go through After Effects and then go through Media Encoder. But I just remembered there might be a spot in Media Encoder just to bring the images in and just make it a movie, just like a one-step kind of thing. If you're not familiar with it, Media Encoder allows you to take any video, audio, image, or whatever, bring it in, convert it, and then send it out as a different format. That's all it does. But what it does really good, though, is compresses it smaller. So if you have, let's see how big these images are. If I grab all my images here and look at the properties, this is about 79 megabytes. So it should be able to compress this to obviously smaller than 79 megabytes and put it into a movie. You could even take a movie, bring it in, and sometimes it can make that smaller too. You might lose some quality, but it'll be smaller. So I'm just going to test this real quick and see if this allows me to do this. That looks like a lot of different formats. D, there. Oops, nope, that will not do that. Yes, it will do that. Cool. Okay. So open up Media Encoder, Adobe Media Encoder. Now this will not allow us to do any editing, which typically you could do too. Just like Photoshop, if you have an image, you want to tweak the saturation, you want to tweak the color, the levels, the curves, whatever it is. You could do that same thing inside of After Effects. Another assignment when we do the actual mini room one, I'll show bringing this into After Effects. If you wanted to add audio, that would be After Effects. If you wanted to put clips together, that would also be After Effects. This is going to allow us basically to bring in a sequence, make it a movie, and that's it. So Adobe Media Encoder. Let me know when it's open because I know sometimes it opens it pretty slow while we're waiting for it to open. All right, so here's, this is how easy this is to do inside Media Encoder. Over here on the right, you see it says Q, and then add source. And so you want to find your image sequence. So it should be on the P drive, your folder, your mini room, renders, and then you just click on a single one of your images. Don't click on all of them, just click a single image. Okay, once you have that single image selected, just hit open. And then that will bring that sequence into Media Encoder. It's going to convert it to an H.264, which is what we want it to do. And then it'll put it right here inside your renders. Okay, so you can rename it if you want here. You just click it, give it a new name, Sarcona _ playing movie. or you can rename it after. Either way works. Once you've named it, you hit the go button. Now the cool thing about Media Encoder is that it's basically like a queue. So if all those renderings that I just showed you, I could load each one of those into here, tell it where I want them to save, the names, the formats, whatever, hit go, and then walk away from my computer and it'll do all that work, okay? These are gonna go pretty quick, it's already done. Some of them will take more time. Some of them may take a few minutes. If you're in the After Effects class, the later assignments of After Effects, sometimes those take like a half hour to render out, okay? So that's it. So now if we look inside of our folder, we should see a movie, and we double click it, there it is. Voila! Gorgeous. Not bad for 2 hours worth of work, right? Sweet. So I'm going to close my folder. I'm going to close Media Encoder. I'm going to save my cinema file and close that. And where's my P drive? There you is. There we go. All right, so we are done for the day. So save your stuff. I recommend backing up that folder. We're not going to use this file again. This is just playing, just so you can kind of see those steps to go through the process. But I would grab that folder and save it regardless, because you do have your folder structure kind of set up on there. Also, if you ever want to reference back, how did we do that ground? How did we do the dynamics? You have that file to go to. Okay?